at the end of the day, we'll present the evidence, we'll present it with caveats, we'll present it with caution. And, I will always say as I would to students I'm teaching, what I'm telling you now is based on what the evidence shows now. In 10 years' time, I might be totally wrong. Mm-hmm. All of these trials showing CDORs are fine. I might be wrong in 10 years' time. I mean, I doubt it, because there's enough research. But as scientists, that's something else, we always caveat with. And I think sometimes that's difficult for the general public, maybe. I mean, I might be doing a disservice, I don't know, that you have the non-active side or non-active influencers, science influencers, I don't know what you call them, that speak with such certainty. Now, I will if it's my study. So I'll talk with certainty over the CDOR study because I've done them. I've been there in the lab analysing it. Or I'll speak with certainty over snacking data because I've, sweated blood and tears over, running the stats, etc. But I won't talk with certainty about anything else that I haven't done myself. And yet you have other people talk with such certainty. And I think that's what instills confidence in maybe listeners. And that's why they get more viewers.
If you've been thinking of starting your own business, I want to take a moment to nudge you into action. This is the month to begin, and my show sponsor Shopify has made it easy enough to turn that business idea in your head into a reality. So if you've got the idea, Shopify has the tools. They remove all of the hurdles that usually come when launching an online business. With thousands of customizable templates and intuitive tools, you can launch a global storefront in minutes, reaching customers all over the world. And here's the kicker. All your sales channels are in one place, including any social media marketplaces you want to sell through. So I'll leave you with this question. How will you feel if a year from now, you're still in the same spot? The time is now to take that leap and sign up for your £1 per month trial at shopify.com/Bartlett. That's shopify.com/Bartlett. There's a lot of nutribolics around dairy, right?
Yep.
I think the prevailing nutribolics is that dairy is bad for you?
Yep. So there's not lots of nutribolics around dairy, and it's related to the nutribolics also around saturated fat. So as a whole, we know saturated fat is bad for us. Dairy contributes to most of the saturated fat intake in the UK. So therefore, we could say all dairy is bad for us. But no, dairy is a diverse food group. You've got cheese, you've got yogurt, you've got butter, you've got milk. And how they impact our health is vastly different depending on whether it's a liquid, a solid, it's fermented, it's non-fermented, etc., etc. And grouping them all together is as ridiculous as grouping all these snacks together in terms of their health effects. And what we now know is that some dairy is actually good for us. So some dairy, like cheese, like yogurt, and I don't mean this really kind of heavily sweetened sugary yogurt. I mean like your Greek yogurts, your kefirs, those sorts of things, your plain yogurts. They've undergone a process called fermentation, and that changes the food matrix. So again, we're coming back to that whole importance of the structure of the food. And by changing the food matrix, changes how our body handles it, how the health effect of that cheese. We don't fully understand how. Mm-hmm. There's some great research being undertaken at Reading University, really diving into this. But what we know is if you have cheese, within reason, if you have yogurt, within reason, it does not increase your cholesterol despite being high in saturated fat. Now, I have to caution that I'm not saying people should go and have 300 grams of cheese every day, but within normal kind of intakes of a few portions a day, it does not increase people's cholesterol, having cheese or having, good yogurt. Butter, on the other hand, we do know does increase your cholesterol. Now, if you're having it at the kind of level that you would maybe just putting it on a bit of toast, I wouldn't worry so much. But we do know that if you were to compare cheese versus butter, which has almost the same fat composition, and this has been shown in randomised controlled trials, the butter will increase your cholesterol, but the cheese will not.
And nuts. A lot of people say that nuts cause weight gain.
No. The evidence does not support that. So we know that people who consume nuts, based on the totality of the evidence, do not gain weight. We know this from epidemiological data, i.e. people who consume more nuts tend to quite often have a lower BMI. Now, that could be confounded by the fact that nut consumers, and only about 10% in the UK, and even less, about 7% in the US, even consume nuts. Nut consumers tend to have a healthier overall diet. So there is that confounding, but clinical trials show that if you add nuts to your diet, ours included, you do not gain weight. Now, that might be partly because of the mechanisms that we've talked about to do with the food matrix, that 20 to 30% of the calories are being excreted. So the back of pack labelling shows that per portion of nut is 170 calories. But actually, on average, you only absorb 130 calories. So lots of it's coming out. It might be because, they're feeding the microbiome that's helping, reduce adiposity. It's also nuts are satiating. So they make you feel more full. They also blunt your blood sugar response. They have so many other benefits that counterbalance any potential for weight gain.
And is there anything else on the Nutribolics list that is worth highlighting?
I would say that I think there's still lots of confusion around saturated fat and around cholesterol.
So cholesterol, I went and did a blood test, and the doctor said to me that one of my cholesterol was a little bit on the higher side. This was last year. So, and I think it was the HDL cholesterol? I don't know. The way that I experienced it was there's this good cholesterol and this bad cholesterol. And like my bad one was like a little bit, behave. Like it's getting a little bit into the region where he might have more of a stern talk with me. That was last year. I think I've done better this year. But what is cholesterol? And my simplified explanation of it, is that flawed in some way? Good, bad?
No, it's always a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complex. But there are two ways that we can look at cholesterol. We can look at cholesterol in terms of the cholesterol we eat.
Right.
And that's where I think there's a lot of misinformation. And we can look at cholesterol in terms of the cholesterol that our body produces. So our liver is constantly churning out cholesterol. When the liver churns out cholesterol, it packages cholesterol into two different kind of packages, or two different types of parcels. And the labelling, so to say, on these parcels determines the health effects of that cholesterol. So you've got your HDL cholesterol, which we call our good cholesterol. You've got your LDL cholesterol, which we call your bad cholesterol.
Okay, so L is bad.
Yes.
H is good. Okay.
Yes. They're actually the same in terms of the cholesterol, but it's the label that's on the parcel, the label in terms of which is directing where they go, which is different. So in really simple terms, LDL is directed, posted to your peripheral tissues, to your blood vessels, where it can be taken up, and in the right environment where there's inflammation, oxidative stress, etc., can result in atherosclerosis, which is that kind of furring of the arteries, which over time can build up and can lead to a heart attack, etc., etc.
Okay.
HDL, in very simple terms, has a label on it that actually enables the reverse cholesterol transport. So it actually almost kind of cleans up some of the cholesterol. This is kind of in very simple terms. So if any lipidologists are listening, they might be a bit frustrated. But in very simple terms, and kind of brings it back to the liver for disposal.
Okay.
So that's why it's considered good. What we know is that the amount of LDL cholesterol that's circulating is really important in terms of our cardiovascular disease risk. There are some cholesterol deniers, and I know you've had on your show a cholesterol denier. I don't believe in the evidence he presents. I think that the totality of the evidence is very, very clear that as your LDL cholesterol increases, your risk of cardiovascular disease, your risk of all-cause mortality increases. Where there is misinformation is around dietary cholesterol, that there was this perception years ago that if you have foods high in dietary cholesterol, like eggs, that it will increase your circulating cholesterol and therefore increase your risk of heart disease. And therefore, there was a limit years ago put on how many eggs we should eat, how much cholesterol we should consume. We now know within certain limits, so within the limits that we typically eat our food containing cholesterol, that dietary cholesterol does not impact our circulating cholesterol. Obviously, at extremes, it does. But if you're having 1 to 2 eggs a day, that's an intake of cholesterol that's not going to negatively, for most people, impact your circulating levels of this LDL bad cholesterol. if you're having 10 eggs a day, then I would be worried.
Okay.
But yeah, cholesterol's another area of nutribolics. And then, on this whole area of cholesterol,
sake,
heart
how the
disease,
hell-
I think a really frustrating area of nutribolics is saturated fat.
So we'll talk about saturated fats. Just so I'm super clear on the cholesterol point, what foods have really high levels of cholesterol, LDL circulating cholesterol in them?
Okay, so you've got dietary cholesterol, which is just the cholesterol that's in the food,
Yeah.
and that has very little impact on circulating cholesterol.
Okay.
Then you have cholesterol that the liver produces, and the liver produces that from scratch. And it's how diet impacts the liver production that determines how diet impacts our circulating cholesterol. So saturated fat increases the production of cholesterol by our liver and reduces the removal of cholesterol by our liver. Highly refined carbohydrates can also increase the production of cholesterol by our liver. So when we're thinking about how diet impacts our cholesterol, particularly our LDL, so our bad cholesterol, we don't need to worry so much about dietary cholesterol, i.e. how much cholesterol is in a food, because unless it's extreme, it will have a minimal impact. We need to think about how much saturated fat, for example, we're having, because that's one of the main dietary determinants of our cholesterol level.
Okay. And what is a saturated fat
So
versus like a normal fat? Like, is there good and bad fats?
yes, there
Okay.
are good and bad fats. All of the fats that we eat, or 98% of the fat that we eat, comes in the form of a molecule called a triglyceride. And a triglyceride has within it 3 fatty acids. And it's the mix of these fatty acids that determine the health properties of that triglyceride, the melt profile of that triglyceride, et cetera, et cetera. And there's lots of different types of fatty acids. So you're probably familiar with amino acids,
Yeah.
which are types of protein. And in the way that amino acids are what make up protein, fatty acids are what make up a fat and the quality of that fat. And we typically separate them into 3 main classes: saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. And you might have heard of those terms.
Yeah, loosely, yeah.
And saturated fatty acids differ in terms of their biochemistry, and I won't bore you with that. To mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids, they also differ in terms of their melt profiles, so like how hard they are or liquid they are. Most tend to be hard, hence why most hard fats, like butter, most animal fats which are hard at room temperature, tend to be high in saturated fats. Mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids differ from saturated fatty acids in terms of their biochemistry, in terms of their melt profile. They tend to be liquid. And polyunsaturated fatty acids are a very special type of fatty acid because they're actually essential for us. Our body can't make them. And so they're essential fatty acids. And one of those is omega-6, which is the fatty acid found in seed oils, which is what people say is why seed oils are bad for us, which hopefully we've debunked that. And saturated fat as a whole, we know, is linked to increased risk
Why
of
do you need it
cardiovascular
in oil
disease,
form,
increased
though?
risk of
You still
all-cause
just have
mortality.
the seeds.
But there's lots of people that say, we've got it wrong as nutritional scientists. We don't know what we're talking about it, because actually there's this meta-analysis that showed that actually saturated fat isn't bad for us. And that's because when we think about the health effects of food, we have to always think of that instead of what. So there was some work that was carried out looking at hundreds and hundreds of different clinical trials where they've replaced saturated fat in the diet with carbohydrates or trans fats or polyunsaturated fats or monounsaturated fats. And what this research showed is that if you replace saturated fats with whole grain carbohydrates, you have an improvement in health. If you replace saturated fats with poly or monounsaturated fats, you have an improvement in health. If you replace saturated fats with refined carbohydrates, there's no difference. So you could take that study and you could say, and this is of hundreds of different studies, and say, saturated fats are really bad for us because we know that if you replace them with whole grain or poly or monounsaturated fats, you have a beneficial effect. Or I could take the same analysis and say, saturated fats are fine, nutritionists have got it all wrong. Because actually, there's no detrimental effect if you compare it with refined carbohydrates. And this is exactly what happened. When this meta-analysis came out probably about 15 years ago, I remember looking at the headlines of two different papers. I won't say what the papers are, but one, I would say, is a little bit more evidence-based, and one is a good example of clickbait headlines. They had totally different headlines. One said, nutrition scientists have got it all wrong, we've been lied to, saturated fats are fine. The other said, research, again, consistently shows saturated fats are detrimental to our health. Obviously, that one's right.
And they're talking about the same study.
Talking about the same study, because it's the instead of what. And that's really important when we think about the health effects. The other thing that does complicate things a little bit with saturated fats is there's lots of different types of saturated fats. We know that the type of saturated fat matters, but we know the food matrix that it's in that matters, and the dairy is a great example. So you have cheese and butter, exactly the same or almost identical fat composition, two entirely different effects on our cholesterol. So it is a little bit more nuanced than saying all saturated fat's bad. It depends on the type and the food it's in.
And what types of food have saturated fats that have a less than healthy food matrix?
So I would say the type of saturated fats that we want to avoid are the saturated fats that are found in most animal products, except fermented dairy, except cheese, except yogurt. So beef tallow, I would say the evidence consistently shows, is not favourable for our health. Lard, butter in large amounts. And then the meat the fat that's intrinsic to the meat. Take salami, you can see the fat in there. Take steak, for example. Cut off the visible bits of the fat. It's okay in small amounts. I'm not saying we should avoid it totally. But if you have the option of kind of cutting off, trimming the fat, then I would. And then there are some tropical oils that are very high in saturated fat. Palm oil, for example, coconut oil, although the jury's out on the health effects of coconut oil. But palm oil, for example, is very high in saturated fat. We know it increases our cholesterol.
If you had to give me some principles for eating, based on everything we've talked about today, and I had to force you to just give me 5 principles for eating, what would those 5 principles be?
5, okay. I would say, first and foremost, find a food or dietary pattern that you enjoy, that brings you pleasure.
Cookies.
Okay, but these aren't exclusive to each other, Stephen, okay?
Okay, fine. That brings me pleasure. Okay.
That's really important. These are not exclusive. Okay, so a dietary pattern that brings you pleasure.
Because
food is there to be enjoyed, and it will be a sustainable dietary pattern, and because we know that consistency and sustainability is really important in how you eat.
Okay.
Second, I would say, think about how you eat. Think about how fast you're eating.
Slow down.
Chew more.
Chew more.
Don't eat late at night. Try and eat within a 10 or 12 hour eating window.
And just on this chew more point, before we started recording, you were saying that you wouldn't mind if I chewed some nuts and spat them out so you could look at them. Why does chewing more have an impact again, just so I'm clear?
So chewing can impact how you break the food down.
Yeah.
Obviously. But we also know chewing impacts your hunger and your fullness signals. So there's some evidence to show if you chew your food 40 times versus 15 times, it can result in a difference in how full that food makes you feel.
Okay, so the chewing effect is sending some kind of signal
Yep.
to my brain.
Yep. Again, this isn't an area that I have expertise in, but that's what the evidence is showing. So as well as your gut sending signals to your brain, receptors on your gut saying whether you're full, there's something going on when you're chewing your food as well that's important.
Okay.
And chewing your food also changes the rate, therefore, at which you're eating. So it changes your eating speed.
Okay. Makes sense. So on that second point, I've got slow down, chew more, don't eat late at night.
And eat within a 10 to 12 hour eating window.
10, 12 hour eating window.
Then the third would be go back to basics. have a good amount of fibre, have a good amount of healthy oils.
That's your olive oils and your...
Olive oil, dare I say it's seed oils, but olive oil I would say is the king and queen of the oils. And, have that balanced plate rather than obsessing over a single food.
Okay. Number 4?
Don't think of food in isolation.
Okay.
Think about your diet in relation to or alongside your sleep, your stress, your physical activity.
And number 5?
Can you remind me of what I've done?
Yes. So number...
I'm 48. I'm in the depths
It's
of
okay.
perimenopause.
Yeah.
So I'm one of those 90% of people that have brain fog and memory loss.
So number 1 was food that brings you pleasure, which
Yep.
is sustainable and allows you to be consistent. Number 2 is really thinking about how you eat, so slowing down, chewing more, not eating late at night, and trying to have a shorter eating window of 10 to 12 hours. Number 3 was go back to basics, which is high fiber, whole grains, fruits, healthy oils, and overall just a balanced plate. And number 4 is don't think of your nutrition in isolation. So think of it in the context of your exercise, your sleep, and all of these other lifestyle factors. And number 5.
Don't deny yourself anything.
Don't
Think about what you can add in rather than what you take away.
Don't deny yourself anything. So cookies are still on the menu.
Occasionally, yes.
You mentioned there perimenopause. You said you're in perimenopause currently. How does that factor into everything we've talked about today? And what is because I've got this graph here that I found about the menopause transition, which talks about how different sort of things are happening inside the body. We've seen this quite a few times before,
Yeah.
which I'll put on the screen and link below for anybody. But what is the relationship between my diet and my menopause journey? Is there anything to be aware of?
There is. I mean, the menopause has a huge impact on how we respond to food. It has a huge impact generally on all of these pillars of health that we've talked about: our sleep, our stress, our physical activity, and diet. And I think it's something we're talking about a lot more now, and we should be talking about it a lot more now. 50% of the population at some point are going to go through the menopause, and it's a transitional period of great disturbance, great disruption, and of great burden to many women. And we've conducted lots of research at Zoe on the menopause. And what we know is that prior to the menopause, which is basically the point 1 year after your last menstrual cycle, you have this perimenopausal transition period where your estrogen and other hormones are fluctuating day to day. So it's like this roller coaster, which I think your graph shows really nicely.
Yep.
You've got this roller coaster of hormones. And so what's happening is your estrogen isn't just slowly declining as you reach perimenopause, so that transitional period before your menopause, but you're on this roller coaster. And it becomes more regulated after the menopause, but you're still in that point where you're having less estrogen, so less of the hormone that we know has such wide-reaching effects. And the reason that the perimenopause transition, as well as postmenopause period in a woman's life, is so important is because estrogen, the hormone that fluctuates during the perimenopause and then reduces and declines in postmenopause, has effects all over our body. Nearly every cell in our body has estrogen receptors. So our brain, our blood vessels, nearly everywhere. So this roller coaster of estrogen during the perimenopausal phase and also the reduction postmenopausally has far-reaching health effects. So, for example, postmenopausally, women are 5 times greater risk of having a heart attack. Now, some of that's due to age, but it's also due to the loss in estrogen. Women are 5 times more likely to have abdominal obesity, which is fat around the tummy, and that's because of estrogen's role in fat tissue deposition, so where fat tissue is deposited. We see in our own Zoe Predict research, pre-menopause, women are doing well compared to men in terms of many of these, what we call intermediary risk factors of cardiovascular disease: blood pressure, cholesterol, glucose, insulin, etc. As soon as they hit the menopause, suddenly they catch up with men nearly everywhere. So this roller coaster of estrogen during the perimenopausal phase and also the reduction postmenopausally has far-reaching health effects. So, for example, postmenopausally, women are 5 times greater risk of having a heart attack. Now, some of that's due to age, but it's also due to the loss in estrogen. Women are 5 times more likely to have abdominal obesity, which is fat around the tummy, and that's because of estrogen's role in fat tissue deposition, so where fat tissue is deposited. We see in our own Zoe Predict research, pre-menopause, women are doing well compared to men in terms of many of these, what we call intermediary risk factors of cardiovascular disease, blood pressure, cholesterol, glucose, insulin, etc. As soon as they hit the menopause, suddenly they catch up with men and it gets worse. And so suddenly their blood pressure's higher than men or their cholesterol's the same level as men. So we see this as well in our Zoe Predict research that postmenopausally and perimenopausally, people's cholesterol and their bad cholesterol, their LDL cholesterol, increases by 25%. And this is all related to the wide-reaching role that estrogen has in our body. We also see that estrogen impacts, and therefore the perimenopause and postmenopause, how we metabolize food. So we see bigger excursions in post-meal glucose and post-meal fat after the menopause. Again, it's all linked to the role that estrogen plays in our metabolism. And then I think what's most important to be aware of regarding the perimenopause and postmenopause phase is the symptoms that women experience. And we've done some research in 70,000 individuals where we've looked at how prevalent these symptoms are. We see that 99% of perimenopausal women experience at least one menopausal symptom. We see that 66% of perimenopausal women have 12 symptoms or more. And this has a huge burden. We know from other surveys, 10% of women leave the workforce during the perimenopause and postmenopausal phase because of the burden that these symptoms have on their quality of life.
And what age does this typically occur, the perimenopausal symptoms?
So typically people become menopausal, as in postmenopausal, stop their menstrual cycles at 51. The menopausal transition period can be anything from 2 to 10 years. Typically, people would say maybe around the ages of 47, many women start to experience perimenopausal symptoms. And these include symptoms like brain fog, anxiety, memory loss, irritability, low libido, change in metabolism. And now I'm in that postmenopausal phase and have forgotten all of the others, but there's about 50 symptoms that are recognised. And we see in our own research that the amount of women experiencing symptoms is really high. So we see that 85% of women are saying they have brain fog, they have anxiety, they have memory loss. It's really high, the amount of women that are experiencing these symptoms. And what's really interesting is we know, yes, HRT, so hormone replacement therapy, or MHT, can help reduce many of these symptoms. But we also know that diet can help as well. And I think actually, Stephen, one of the most interesting things from our research looking at menopause and symptoms is that typically when we think of menopausal symptoms, we think about hot flushes. Mm-hmm. And if I was to ask you, actually, I wished I'd have asked you before I said that, but if I was to ask you, if you were to think of a menopause symptom, what would come to your mind first?
I would say hot flushes, because that seems to be the only time that people talk about hot flushes is when they're talking about menopause in my world. And then I'd say brain fog.
Yep. And what's really interesting is hot flushes are one of the least common symptoms. About 40% of women in our research have hot flushes. 85% have brain fog. 85% have all of the other brain-related symptoms. And yet typically we always think about hot flushes. And this is because there just hasn't been loads of research on menopause. And so I think what's really exciting is there is now a lot more research on menopause. So I think the future's really exciting. But I think what comes with this is yet more nutribolics. Mm-hmm. And that's because I think there's this whole area of what we call meno-washing. I don't know if you heard of meno-washing.
No, I haven't.
Stick meno, for menopause, in front of any product, you can charge 10 times as much. I could call this a menopause tea. It's actually Yorkshire tea, and it's a very good cup of tea. I could call this meno tea and charge 10 times as much for that tea bag.
Because
without any evidence. Because women are desperate. 45% of women say their symptoms are so burdensome, they'll try anything. 10% leaving the workforce because of their symptoms. And so we have to be really careful that we are only selling evidence-based supplements for which there isn't much evidence at the moment. And I think that the evidence that an overall healthier dietary pattern can reduce symptoms is the best way forward for now, alongside for those who choose to hormone replacement therapy.
A recent survey showed that 30% of menopausal women are trying herbal remedies, 30% are trying vitamins, and 51% are trying any kind of dietary therapy as an alternative to HRT. That was in iNews, which kind of supports what you're saying, that there's lots of people searching for. Because I think from the experiences that I've had with people talking to me about menopause, it seems to be an incredibly confusing period of life where you can't make sense of what's happening.
Yeah.
And all the old rules of just, hit the gym and eat a bit healthier seem to go out the window because there's something deeper at play in your body. So it's not that you're not eating right, or it's not that you're not sleeping right. It's a deeper hormonal fluctuation that you've actually never experienced before. So of course you're going to be really confused and quite easily gaslit as well, I imagine, because I've had someone say to me that they felt like they were going crazy, and then people started thinking they were just like kind of going crazy a little bit.
Yeah, I think, fortunately, I think it's changing.
Yeah.
But historically, we didn't talk about it. I vaguely remember my mum saying, oh, I'm really hot, I'm having hot flush. But we didn't talk about menopause. We didn't talk about periods. Mm-hmm. We just didn't talk about it in that, when I was growing up. And unfortunately, my mother's no longer alive, so I don't really know what she did go through. And I want to talk about it. People are talking about it. We have people like Davina McCall who are amazing because they're getting women talking about it, so we're no longer ashamed. Mm-hmm. So I think the tide is really turning. But menopause is this perfect storm because you have these burdensome symptoms, and then you have alongside it, which I don't think we talk about enough, is these health effects that I talked about. So women going through the menopause aren't sleeping. I mean, my sleep is all over the place. Honestly, when I get a good night's sleep, Stephen, I feel like Superwoman. It reminds me of the state I'm in at the moment is like how I was when I had kids, where, I'm getting 4 or 5 hours sleep, then I wake up. If I'm lucky, I might get better sleep. So you've got women, they're not getting enough sleep. You've got women who often are feeling a bit depressed or anxious or, are losing their confidence because of their brain fog, because of their memory loss, because of, their anxiety. You've got the hormones changing your body composition. Suddenly you're eating and doing everything the same.
Oh, shit.
That's being directed to your tummy. Your hunger signals are mucked up. Your desire to eat different food changes. And we see this again in our own research. Postmenopausal women tend to eat a lot more sugary foods than premenopausal women. So
why didn't I get any mana? I did evocation.
And then in amongst that, do you really want to do some physical activity? Are you really motivated to start eating healthier? And, when you're exhausted, and it goes back again to that importance of sleep and that interaction of sleep with our food choices and how we respond to food. There's so many things to think about, and I think it's really tough in that peri and postmenopausal phase when your body's changing, when you're tired, when you're feeling a bit rubbish, to also take control of your diet. But it's the most important time because it's when your cholesterol increases, it's when your blood pressure increases, it's when all of this fat tissue around your belly is releasing harmful inflammatory chemicals, etc. So it's when, unfortunately, we really do need to take stock of our physical activity, of what we're eating and our stress levels. But it's probably one of the most challenging times to do it as well.
You must be incredibly stressed through that period, but also just thinking about your relationships. If you're in a relationship, in a heterosexual marriage with a husband who isn't going through that at that period of their life, and you said there was a libido issue that's symptomatic of menopause as well, to navigate all of that and for the people around you to understand what's going on in your head must be incredibly stressful. Incredibly stressful. I'm very, I feel very, I don't know what the right words are here, but I feel very sympathetic. Because I can't imagine, I don't think there's a point in the man's life where we go through such a profound change in our hormones in such a confusing way all of a sudden. So it's like...
But I think, Stephen, if we raise awareness so that men are aware and they can support their partners, and libido, as an example, we see in our own research, whilst it might not be the most common, women rate it as the most burdensome.
Really?
So we monitor not just the prevalence, so how common the symptoms are, we also ask people how much impacts their quality of life. And the peri and postmenopausal women rate that as their symptom that has the most burden on their life.
Because if I'm not slept and I'm not feeling sexy, I'm independent of whether there's like a chemical impact on my hormone levels that causes my lowering of libido, I'm not trying to have sex.
You want to go to sleep?
I want to go to sleep, yeah, exactly. So even if, and especially I don't feel good, I don't feel sexy, my mood might be altered, and
your tummy
I'm
suddenly
tired.
grows.
Yeah, it's not going to be. So what advice do you give to the women going through that? You said that you were on hormone replacement therapy yourself previously, and that's had I guess a positive impact on your menopause journey.
Yes, I still sleep really badly.
Yeah.
I don't think HRT is the answer for everyone, and some people can't take it if they're contraindicated with certain risk related to cancer, and some people choose not to take it, and it certainly doesn't solve everything. I do think the evidence is very compelling for reduction in many symptoms. I think the evidence is compelling or increasing and building